All right, it is 5:30. I would like to call the special board meeting to order. May I have roll call, please?
Delgado. Jacobs.
Present.
Did you call Jacobs?
I did. Levy.
Here.
Miller.
Present.
Anderson.
Here.
Wong.
Here.
Larson.
Here.
All members are present. We have Anderson and Larson and Wong in the boardroom. And we have Delgado, Jacobs, Levy, and Miller virtually.
May I have approval of the agenda, please?
So moved. Second.
We have a motion, a second, to approve the agenda. Are there any questions or discussion regarding the agenda? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the agenda, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, the agenda is approved, which brings us to our first agenda item, which is overview of interim superintendent evaluation process. And for this, we have Dr. John Bales, the executive director of WASDA, to start us off with this process. So thank you, John, for being here with us, and welcome.
Thanks, Kyle. My pleasure. Good evening, everybody. Kyle said in introduction, I'm John Bales, and worked with WASDA. I know you're faced with alphabet soup all the time, so WASDA is the superintendent's group. Been in this for 8 years, longtime superintendent prior to that, with a long history in working with board effectiveness and board training and those types of things. So always have an interest in these kind of conversations, especially interested in this evening because, as I understand it, so many of you are new to the board or relatively new, and you have an opportunity with a new superintendent, and it's a great time to do board development topics and to sort of work together and think together about how you're going to work as a team. So it's a great time to have this conversation. I give you kudos for setting aside the time because I'm quite sure you got a pretty heavy plate trying to get school going this fall. It's been quite a season. So I did provide a PowerPoint. I use it as much as anything to guide the conversation. I really hope that if you, when and where you choose to make it interactive, that you'll do so. And please don't hesitate at any point to stop me, ask a question. I don't usually monitor the raise hands bit, so just interject if you have a question or want me to talk a little bit in more detail about something. But hopefully then have plenty of opportunity during and afterwards to ask any questions. I'll try to honor the time. I understand it's about 60 minutes, but that's a long sit and get. So we'll make sure that there's opportunity for back and forth. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about the foundational principles of evaluation and what we know about best practices, and that's generally from literature. There's a lot of work being done with boards and a lot of, I'm sure if you've had the opportunity, there's all kinds of materials out there for you. WSB does a nice job doing workshops for boards as well. So plenty of information out there. I'm just going to hit the highlights. My interest is in trying to keep it simple. I've been at this for over 40 years, so bring with that literature a little bit of practical experience that I'll try to share with you in terms of what we observe and what's working around the state with boards that are experiencing a lot of success. So before I jump to evaluation, I just want to, in this first slide, go ahead, Dan, and advance it. I want you to understand the core foundation of effective governance, which is the same in terms of its characteristics as any of the literature you read about organizational development, leadership effectiveness, governance effectiveness. It will all distill itself down to these three things. Now, these are just the labels that we choose, but it's these three concepts. One is that you as a governing board must have some clarity around your focus. what your key priorities are, call it results, call it goals, whatever it might be. What is the end in mind for you in the system? That's critical to know. And again, being relatively new to the process, and certainly Dan being new, it's a great time for you to revisit, affirm, or in the absence, clarify and define what those critical focus areas are for you in the school system. And ideally, you do that representing the public. In truth, the school district belongs to the owners, the taxpayers, and so you on that board represent those folks. It isn't about you as individuals. It's you and your role on that governing board serving the public and meeting their interests that they have for their school district. So focus is first and foremost. That's the primary work of a board. The operational alignment then is the part where you hire an executive with educational knowledge and experience to come and provide for you the means, the infrastructure by which you're going to accomplish those results and those outcomes that you want for the school district. So everything that Dan does and his team and the staff is thoughtful about how does it align with the folks that you've identified. So you're familiar enough with all kinds of organizations in your business, in your professional life, I'm sure, or even in your family. If you don't know what your end in mind is, it's pretty hard to know how to put together the structures, the systems, and the processes to accomplish those things. So everything they do ought to make sense and ought to align with what your focus is. So you as a board don't need to design those things, but you certainly are going to want to know what they are. That's part of your role to always know what systems and processes and practices are in place and promoted and sustained, and how those things align with the focus. So that's one of the aspects of alignment. But a part that's often missing is the alignment the board has to have for itself to make sure your time and your work and your energy is all towards accomplishing the things you said are the priorities in the focus areas. So evaluation is one of those alignment activities. Just like you sort out as a board, how do you spend your time? How do you build agendas? How do you make sure you're on the things that matter most and not on small items, operational items that can be left to someone else? So aligning yourself is important. Evaluation is a critical piece of that because obviously you want to make sure that what Dan is doing is in effect accomplishing the things you said should be accomplished, and importantly is operating in a way that's consistent with how you want him to operate. So that's alignment on two sides of the coin there that I think is often a missing element. And the third thing is commitment, which simply means you're going to institutionalize the things that matter. I know your recent history, and I think one of the challenges that systems face when there's change and turnover is that you have this sort of period of wandering and needing to reconnect with, well, what are we all about here? What are our core priorities, our core outcomes that we're after? And in truth, that ought not shift when you get different people on a board necessarily or a different superintendent. Those things are reflective of the values and principles and priorities of your community. Those aren't going to change so much. They'll certainly evolve, but they're not going to change dramatically. And so some of these things are institutional to Beloit and not shifting necessarily with personalities. So those are the three concepts that kind of get weaved through any of the work you do, and you'll hear me come back to those as we talk about evaluation. But I think for you, it's important to think about those core concepts and always ground yourself in those and come back to those whenever you feel like there's a drift, either from leadership or within the board. So next slide on evaluation itself. You'd ask yourself three questions. Why do we do it? It's pretty simple. Your job, your responsibility on the board is really two things. One is to see to it that that school district accomplishes the things the community says it's supposed to accomplish. What do the owners expect of that institution? And the closer you are to knowing and understanding that, the more credible you'll be and more effective you'll be in your role. But your job is to see that it accomplishes the things it's supposed to accomplish. And your second job is to see that it operates in such a way that it's in alignment with the values and the priorities and the expectations of the community and of you as a reflection of that community. So those two things are important. You evaluate because you've hired an administrator whose job it is to find the means by which that's going to happen. So you want to evaluate that those results are being accomplished reasonably and that operations are such in the district that they're consistent. So that's your job, is to make sure of those things. What you're going to look at, as I said, are those two things, results. It's less about a number outcome. I think any of us in education know this. It's not about, we want X score on the 4th grade reading. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But you certainly want to know that we are progressing effectively towards the things that are most important to us, that we have systems in place to correct and modify where we're not being successful. What are those systems? And that on a performance basis and a practice basis, your executive is operating in a way that they should. So those things are what you're going to look at. The $64,000 question is which instrument. My take on this, we don't as an organization recommend any one particular instrument. There are hundreds literally out there. States have sometimes tried to develop a uniform one across the state. In almost every case, it's been rejected ultimately by boards. And I think that the reason for that is that it's difficult to take a boilerplate instrument unless, and make it effective for you and make it relevant for you, unless you've sort of translated it into your local language. So the operative thing, I think, is that the instrument has to be yours. It has to reflect the things that are true of Beloit. And that's why, even if you picked one, and Dan had shared with me a couple that he's identified that resonated with him, there's nothing inherently wrong with those. But what you would want to do is contextualize whatever instrument you pick. A lot of people like to pick one that's there, then some of the work's already done for you, but it's only relevant if you translate it into your language and in a way that it makes sense to you, so you know what each item and each term means. So next slide, Dan. Thanks. So foundational things, as I said, top of the list is contextualize it. It has to fit what Beloit's core expectations for outcomes and results are, and it has to fit with your things that you are building your alignment around, things that you're committed to, things that sustain themselves. That's really what you are trying to put into your evaluation tool. You collectively as a board know what you want to accomplish. Likewise, you need to have a conversation and identify what exactly is it around the professional practice for our superintendent that's of highest priority to us. What do we want?
May I ask a question quick?
Yeah.
Typically, what role does the district strategic plan play in this discussion about the alignment and the institutional commitment? Like, is it usually aligned with the strategic plan? I'm curious as to which the strategic plan informs our content.
Yep. So, good question. And conceptually, think of it this way. A board's job is to identify the long-term vision and outcome for students. So, for example, a question around that would be for your ultimate result would be after 13 years in our system. Granted, kids come and go, but let's assume in 13 years in our system, what will be true of those kids? That's the end in mind. That will define everything that goes on inside the system ultimately. A strategic plan are the operational strategies, techniques, practices, structures, systems, and processes that you're going to put in place to make sure those things happen. So people, I think, sometimes insert visions and broader views inside strategic plans, so you want to be clear about how you're defining that. But it's an absolute alignment because the strategic plan is the means by which you're going to accomplish the things you said you're going to accomplish. Typically, you would collect input from public, but that's largely, I think, around the vision portion of that, not the operational. I don't expect general public to know how to build school budgets and how to take care of school buildings and those kinds of things. So it is partially board work, but it's largely administrative work to do the operational side of a strategic plan. But everything ought to align. If you think about an end in mind is really a policy statement. You would have a policy about your ultimate ends in the district. What are your core results you're after? What are we all about here? It is the administration's job to translate that into practice. They'd have a strategic plan. They'd have systems and processes. You're going to want to know what that is. Are those reasonable to accomplish those things? You would shape those. You would sort of thumbs up those things. Make sure that they're reflective of the things that are important to you in terms of how things work in practice. So everything has to connect. Whatever you are asking of your superintendent, likely he's going to turn around and ask of the other administrative leaders in the district. Here's the parameters we're operating under. Here's our expectations for you. Here's your priorities, et cetera. Does that make sense, Megan?
Yes, it does. I'm just asking because we're due for a strategic plan, and one of my questions that I had slotted for like a later discussion was when would be a good time to establish like a graduate profile, which is a little bit what you were talking about in the beginning. Like, what do we want our students to walk away with? So I'd like that to set for a later discussion for a later time. But thank you for that context. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I think your mention of the profile of a graduate is a popular way for people to frame the question about what's the end in mind here. What is it we're trying to do? And if that's absent in the district, that's a great place for a young board and a new superintendent to start to engage the public. So,
awesome. Thank you.
So the foundational things on evaluation, long-term, again, going back to that sort of ultimate end in mind, that ought to be reflected in there in some of your results you're seeking. Typically, it's going to be something around whole child student achievement. What are we after? Perhaps addressing the gap, learning gap issues in large districts. So things like that would be long-term goals and aspirations for the district. Continuous growth and mutuality simply means that it ought to be something that's designed and owned by both the board and the superintendent. So this is about making sure that both parties are working in alignment with what the system said is most important. So you want the evaluation to be built around the things that matter. That's going to be true of both the SUP and the board. It ought not be a surprise. It shouldn't shift from year to year. These are the things we're after. Now, you could prioritize things differently from year to year. If, for example, you got a huge referendum coming, that might be a time when you've got more interest in the community engagement side of professional practice. So what are the things you're doing to make sure that you're engaged with the community, for example? But generally speaking, student growth, continuous improvement, learning would be an annual event. And then collective board voice is really the importance of, I think, the whole concept of governance, understanding that it's never about the individual members sitting at the table. It's about the board as a collective. You really only have any status or authority when you're sitting at that board as a board of the whole. Individually, you don't have that kind of authority in a system, and you don't want to assume that because it will violate your role sitting at the table. So same is true of evaluation. What a superintendent needs to know is, what does the board collectively view about my performance? What do they view about the results? Because I can't respond to 5 or 7, in your case, or 9 bosses. I'm responsible and accountable to the board as a whole. So the board working together throughout the evaluation, and I'll talk about that as we go through here, is critical. Next slide. So best practices for you, I'm going to suggest. First, make sure that you're all clear about what your focus is, your core priorities. Those can be both long and short term to some extent. I would think you might want to think about some short term goals that have to do with building the relationship between the board and the superintendent. Foundational sort of principles and expectations about what that relationship is going to look like. And that would be true whether Dan's there or anybody. So those would be policies that kind of have some life to them. But so some of your goals may be built on the fact you've got a new relationship there. But you want to be clear about those. Otherwise, you're evaluating something that you haven't articulated yet. The evaluation, when it is put together, ought to reflect what your core priorities and visions and beliefs are. And importantly, ought to reflect your expectations for your superintendent, which means you've had a deliberate conversation about what those are. and have some common voice about that. Next, it should be built on the notion that is for both professional growth and effectiveness. That's what you want, is a perfect alignment between the community expectations, the reflection that the board has of that, and what you're getting from your superintendent. But it's also for human resource decisions. So whether it's continuing contract, whether it's employment, whether it's discipline, whether it's separation, an evaluation instrument can be useful because it should help you identify, are we in an alignment here between a superintendent and a board or not? Because that alignment's critical. But there's a responsibility, I think, for everybody to be very open about what they're expecting and uniformly clear about that. The design itself, I'll talk a little bit about, think about content, what's in there. Oftentimes a board, I think, makes the mistake of putting way too much in evaluation, and then they end up jumping from instrument to instrument because it's just too all-consuming. Oftentimes you'll hear them make comments, well, I don't even know what some of this stuff means. It takes me 2 hours to do it. I don't have the right information, those kinds of things. And I think sometimes we just need to distill it down to what are the most important things for us. That's what ought to be in the content. And as I said earlier, there'd be a little bit about results and then some about expectations for professional practice for the superintendent. The structure, it has a set structure to it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Most importantly, you'll hear us advise that it is an ongoing process, not a once-a-year event. And I did have an opportunity, Kyle was nice enough to send me your policy on evaluation and your rule. That's one thing I would suggest to you, is to think about regular periodic checks. We always advise new superintendents especially to look at what we call quarterly conversations, so at least 4 to even 6 times a year. You have, as a part of the evaluation, a session together to talk about status. Where are we on these things we said were important? So that it's not a once-a-year event and you've been maybe languishing on something you didn't like for months. I think it's better and better progressively to talk about it. Think about how we deal with students. You want feedback constantly. That's how you learn, and that's how you get the results that you want. So I think it's important to have uniform meeting and understanding. You'll hear me talk about this a lot, is the clarity that comes out of the conversations you have about what items and language in the evaluation instrument mean. And I'll give you some examples of that. And then process, you've got a really nice process. I'll talk about that at the end and kind of where that fits with best practice kinds of processes. Again, the one element that struck me was not having these periodic conversations. I think you had a mid-year check-in, but I'd encourage that to get expanded, and we'll talk about that. So next slide, Dan. So let's talk just a little bit about content. I mentioned the end in mind. There's 3 components, ideally, in the instrument. Most instruments will reflect this. There'll be an item or 2 on end in mind, and you notice I've parenthetically put in here 2 to 4, 2 to 5. Again, trying to get you refined around the things that matter most. You can always add something. You can change things, flip back and forth depending on how things are progressing in the district. But I don't know that you want to evaluate so many that you get lost in the trees. So end in mind, there ought to be some big bucket, big rock results that you're looking for that you'd monitor on an annual basis, regardless of who's in that chair. Operational expectations you will have, I think you refer to those as management in your policy. I tend to, and I didn't invent this, really came out of a sociologist at the University of Chicago, but try to distill the complexity of education, because it's hugely complex, as you know, into 5 basic things. And I'll bet if you went back on your board agendas for the last year, you would see that almost every item fits into one of these 5 buckets. So it's worth always thinking about these 5 core things that go into school operations. It's all the things about kids that are going to be both results, behavior, how we're going to interact with them, how we're going to recognize them, how we're going to manage them. That's all sorts of policies around that. Staff, what are we going to do with and for staff? Everything from the operational side of compensation to the reality of building capacity and professional development plans. What are all those operational things you're going to do? Programs and services, or in schools, curriculum and instruction. the whole infrastructure notion, buildings, grounds, transportation, budget building, those kinds of things. And then what they refer to as environmental, which is the social, political, economic, cultural, historic context that you operate in that district. So you are always paying attention to those, and likely you have some operational expectations for the superintendent in those 5 areas. You're going to want to have systems and processes for hiring the most qualified teachers. You're going to want to have a system and process for how you're going to manage those employees from day to day. You're going to want some interest in how you're engaging those staff in continuous improvement analysis for kids' learning, et cetera. Programs and services, you're going to probably want to know that there some evidence-based, research-based application. You're going to want to have a decision about, are we talking a comprehensive curriculum here, or are we focusing in particular areas? Are we talking about the whole child? Are we going to do preschool? If so, what's our program for that? All of those things, there would be systems and processes around. Infrastructure, obviously, strategic plans often try to look at long-range planning for those kinds of functions. And then environment is everything you have to put those other 4 into. So engagement with the community, engagement with the staff, how we're making sure that we are addressing diversity, equity in everything we do. So all those considerations in a community like yours in a bigger district, you'd want to pay attention to. So you're probably going to have some operational expectations. Some might be more pressing and important to you to look at. But generally, I think you classified it under management. You're going to look at those 5 areas. And then leadership priorities is just the way of saying, you would refer to it as traits. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's the hardest thing for a board to do. Measuring and monitoring a trait and getting clarity around what exactly is it you're looking for, I think is one of the biggest challenges for both the board and the superintendents that I work with. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The Beloit content on the next slide, I think you'll see you're really right on with these things. You've got the management objectives that you're going to have now. I think in your case, you're seeing those as sort of the larger results, outcomes-oriented things. It's blended a little bit with responsibilities. I didn't see the actual list of these. I did see the listing of superintendent functions in that policy. I don't know if that's the same as the job description, but at any rate, you've got the 2 distinctions there between results, outcomes, and operations expectations. And then obviously the personal, professional performance traits. I think there it gets to the emphasis that I'll come to later about the importance of the conversation and clarity about what you're really after. Next slide, Dan, the structural elements. You've got the key items, obviously, that you're going to identify, and fewer is better, generally speaking. Here's the important part. The work that goes into identifying what the evidence is that you're looking for. The questions you would want to ask yourself is, if this is the expectation, what exactly will that look like? How will we know that we've accomplished those things? And what will we do if we don't? And that is a deliberate conversation about what things mean. And I think that is one component that even if you took one of the instruments that Dan proposed, and again, they're fine instruments, I would recommend you have a conversation about every single item on there and have a board discussion about what does that mean to us? What do those terms mean? And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Finally, the rating scale, and I'm going to talk a little bit about rating scales because that's often where things go awry. I think we sometimes feel like, well, if it's numeric, it must be good and objective. And I think in practice, nothing can be further from the truth unless we're deliberately focused on those things. You want it to be clear and objective. The entire point of an evaluation leading to something effective is that it's clear and it's objective and not subjective. Because if it's 7 people's judgment about some term, that does nothing to help the superintendent understand where the board collectively is at. So you can have different perspectives, but you want to talk about those out loud as a board and come to some agreement about what's this going to look like? What are we really looking for here? so it's not misunderstood. And then the rating scale also, you'll hear me talk about making it formative rather than summative. And I'll show you here in a second on a slide what that means. But next slide, Dan. So I know I'm covering a lot here, so please don't hesitate to jump. But let's just take, I took one of the, and I just pulled out a couple examples. So this is a couple of items off of one of the tools that Dan and I were looking at. So the categories, pretty common in superintendent evaluation, public relations, communication, all right? But the item says that a board would say yay or nay on, or be asked to, you're right, maybe rate 1, 2, or 3, or 4 or 5. It says is open and sensitive to community concerns and desires regarding education system. Now, in and of itself, maybe that makes sense, but you could have 7 different opinions about what open and sensitive means. How is he going to put that in practice? What's he going to do that demonstrates to you that he is open and sensitive? How can you objectify that so that there's clarity and uniformity of understanding? Another item under that category is treats the community and board with respect. Intrinsically, we know what that means, but when it comes to evaluation and leading to an alignment and being effective, what does that really mean? What are we looking for? How will we know when we see it? What system can he put in place to facilitate that happening? So that's the importance of understanding what evidence are we looking for? What are the metrics here we're looking for? What are we going to observe so that we know whether we're meeting that and there's compliance with that or not? Likewise, planning and goals establishes clear short-term working goals. That's easy enough to see. You either did those or you didn't. Is able to prioritize. Presumably they can present a prioritization list and accomplish everyday items. That's a huge phrase, accomplish everyday items. What are the everyday items and what's the expectation for those relative to accomplishment? So that's what I mean by taking the time to deliberately think through, and it's to the benefit of the board too, not just the superintendent. What do those things mean? Because it means you're going to have to come to an agreement as a board. What are the most important everyday items? What is it we're after here, really, when we say that? Mobilize staff. What does that mean? How are we going to measure that? How are we going to know if that's happening? Is it inherent if board goals are met that everybody's mobilized? Is that sufficient? Or are we expecting something different when we make that phrase? So not to belabor it, but that's really the critical thing, and that's how you can really personalize and contextualize any instrument as long as a board you talk about what does this mean to us. And that's not always the simplest conversation, but it's critical because it ends up reflecting the collective values of the board about what you expect, which is likely what the community expects. So that's a good conversation to have. And as I said, the more you engage public in deliberate ways, your strategic plan might talk about how do we consistently and deliberately engage the public around important topics on an ongoing basis. Because the closer you are to understanding the broader public, and you got a very diverse public, every community does, but you cannot represent a person or a constituency group. In the governance, you have the responsibility to service and to accomplish the best for all. So how do you know what those things are? That's what you want to reflect in your evaluation instrument.
May I ask a clarifying question again?
Yep, please.
So ask a question. So, okay, from a teacher perspective, as I'm listening to you, I'm envisioning like a descriptive rubric, and I noted that on your next slide you're talking about rating scales. But I just want to stay in their lane, and I want to feel out, would it be appropriate for us as a board, along with Dr. Keister, to come up with like specific examples of what each of these things mean? So like going back a few minutes ago and what you were describing, if we were to like all 8 of us sit down and define within ourselves, here are examples of what sensitive to community concerns looks like. Is that sort of what you're recommending that we do? Or is that, okay, that's not getting too into the weeds on it?
No, I mean, I don't think you need to write, if you're an educator, you can get into real weeds with a rubric. And I'm not arguing against that, but I'm saying I think it would suffice to just have the conversation as a board, give examples so that everybody has an idea of what page we're on here and what we're looking for. So, yeah.
Okay, obviously this is more of a question for Dr. Kuether, and we can all talk about it later, but I just want to, from your perspective, it's a worthwhile conversation to get us started. We can all start on the same page with shared understanding and shared examples, and that would be a productive use of our time to build that collective understanding.
I think so.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dan, you want to do the next slide? Thanks. So rating scales, here's what the literature will tell you about that. First of all, less is more. You've probably seen, if you're a geek on this, you've seen the research on people will debate endlessly. Is it 3 items, 4 items, 5 items, 6 items? There's all kinds of statistical basis for those arguments. In practice, I'm going to suggest, and I'll show you in a second why, that less is more. Because it's really about, are we getting the message about what's working or not working, and what do we do to improve it continuously? It's not about getting lost in the gradient between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 4 and 5. So less is more, just make sure they're clear. The collective understanding of the meaning we talked about, the closer you are to have a collective understanding, the better the rate of reliability, the more easily you'll be able to say, here's what's missing, here's what we expect, here's how we'd like to see this improve. If you don't have that, then you've got 7 people weighing in on what's either right or wrong, and it leaves the superintendent and the system lacking any clarity about where you are and where to go. As I said, objective rather than subjective. Too often, into the traits conversation, we're really looking for, this kind of subjective feel of, does everybody like them? Is everybody happy? And I'm not saying those are bad things. I'm saying you probably need to be a little clear about what exactly are you expectations for this suit. For example, think actions and performance rather than personality traits. Think you want someone that is a participatory leader. So what you're going to look for in that case, evidence would be there are organized systems and processes in the district that pull people together to discuss issues, to discuss topics, to gather input and advice, to gather feedback. And he can demonstrate to you, here's the systems and processes to do that, both inside and outside the system. He can demonstrate that by actions he does with you, having conversations about reflection and input and feedback about what's going on in the district. So you're looking for evidence of things in terms of a performance that you want. Going to engage, you want somebody, pretty typical these days, be heavily engaged in the public. Then you're going to be looking for systems and processes and structures that put him out in the community. He can demonstrate that. Active roles in civic groups, constant engagement activities with various civic groups or with clergy, important stakeholders in the community, the higher ed community, those kinds of things. So you're looking to try to think in terms of action and objectives, observable. Whole board participation in the process. When 2 or 3 people aren't able to participate in the evaluation, that's missing a major piece. So I think it's an important enough task. You want to make sure you get engagement from everyone on that. Always shifting from the individual to the collective, and I'll talk again about that in a minute with the rating scales here to illustrate that. And narrative versus numerical. So everybody, if you're like most districts, it sounded like you had a sort of a survey. So you each end up with a score. Kyle gets the task of averaging out that score. The next thing Dan knows, he's a 2.4. That tells him nothing because it doesn't tell me what the spread was for people. It doesn't tell me what that number meant to anyone. So the emphasis is on the conversation and the narrative. And we'll talk about that when we talk about process. And then one voice, again, is making sure that the entire process feeds into an opportunity for the board to decide what its message to the superintendent is.
So, John, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful so far. So just for like logistics and clarity, are you recommending that the board should get together and have kind of like a preview of this conversation among ourselves and then bring Dan into that conversation, just to kind of confirm that we have that one voice, that we're not hashing it out and kind of thinking out loud with Dan and then potentially like giving a mixed message or confusion.
That's a really good question, Amy, and I've sort of taken a let the board decide view here, and I'll tell you why. Our recommendation initially, based on some of the research, was that conversation would be with everybody in the room, including the superintendent. So imagine that you had a survey, you had 10 items on it, and you'll hear me talk about this under process. You would sort of arrive at a rating on each of those 10, as would all the other members. Then you would come together and you would be sharing what your rating was and why to the collective. I think what you're asking, in the discussion I've had with a number of boards now, is does the superintendent sit in that conversation while you're talking about what you rated and why? Or do you sort of come to the collective determination of where are we as a group on this item, and then we have that conversation with them. We started off with having everybody in, thinking transparency. It's the more, I'll put on a superintendent's hat here for a minute with you and tell you, the more that I'm able to hear from board members how they think, what they value, what's important to them, how they approach things, the more able I am to translate that into, that is a perspective that is also in the community. So how do we reconcile and pull together all of those perspectives? So the more I hear, the better. At the same time, I've had a number of boards say that will alter the conversation. And that is what has largely made me back up and decide, oh, this is a longer answer than you wanted. But I think it's going to be a comfort thing for the board. You can accomplish the same thing either way. If you'd rather have the initial discussion without the superintendent, all I would suggest is that once then it puts a little bit of the onus on Kyle perhaps to say, all right, I think collectively we're saying we're a 2 on this item, then that becomes what gets communicated. I'd only ask that multiple voices be heard in the conversation when the superintendent gets the feedback. That's the downside, is if Kyle's the only one talking, I didn't get to hear anybody else's perspective. So
let me piggyback on that really briefly. So we have IBMM, so individual board member meetings. Is it appropriate to kind of have some of those casual conversations so you can give feedback in those meetings and they're one-on-one? And then when we come together collectively, then the administrator is able to hear from all of us as a group, individually speaking, and then speaking in one voice. Is that appropriate for those one-on-one meetings?
My own view, it's a good question. I guess my own view on that would be if what is said largely in content in the one-on-one is also shared collectively, then that's okay. If there's a different conversation one-on-one than there is that board member shares at the table, then that puts the superintendent in conflict. So that makes sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Consistency is key.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide, Dan. Thank you. So here's the issue with less is more, and it has to do with the little graphic on the bottom. The issue is the necessity to understand what each of the rating means. So you see here, this particular rating, this is kind of a common grounding on a rating scale. It's a growth area, you're fine, it's competent, you're effective, or it's exemplary, excellent, superior, people use different labels. The importance is that you think through, this is back to Megan's comment about rubrics, right? You're thinking through what's the difference between a 1, a 2, and a 3. And that has to come out of a deliberate conversation and ought to be clearly articulated so that everybody that's rating has an easier time figuring out, based on the evidence I've seen, based on what we're observing, based on the data Dan's going to provide us, or frankly what we've heard and seen throughout the year, I can make a reasonable assessment of 1, 2, or 3. So the more numbers you have in the rating, let's say you got 5, now I've got, 4 gradients to worry about. So we suggest this because I think that's sufficient to make a distinction between what you're after. Are you getting what you're after, or are you not? And interestingly enough, the challenge is, for me, how you arrive at item 3. I've been in multiple board workshops, and I finally had the most clear answer from one board member who said, well, it kind of means that she walks on water. And I'm like, well, that's probably not going to happen. So in a literal sense, so what does that mean? And so that one, I think, is you have to be clear about what exceeding expectations means. Because I suspect for most of us, we expect a really good leader to exceed on things. So how do we do that? And I'll talk about that in a second too. Next slide, Dan. Here's the other problem and why I talk about collective voice. So this is just an illustration for you. This happens to be off a 4-item scale, but the same is true of a 3-item scale if you do the math. So if we just look at the first scale summary here, this was a 9-member board, and you had 1 unsatisfactory, 1 basic, 5 proficient, and 2 distinguished. The overall weighting on that is a 2.89, which means less than proficient. And yet 7 out of the 9 said that the person was proficient or distinguished. So if I just get the 2.89, I have no idea that 7 of the people there think we're doing pretty well. So that's why there has to be the discussion. And I would expect that if I get a spread like this, that's the benefit of the conversation, to have somebody say, how did you read distinguished and how did you read unsatisfactory? Let's talk about that, because it means that that rubric or whatever the explanation is isn't uniformly interpreted by people, or something's missing and that maybe a bit more member or 2 knew and others didn't. So the conversation is always the value. The second frame's the graphic's just another example. Here's one where 6 of 8 said they were proficient, and yet the rating is less than proficient. So, again, you want the conversation, the narrative, not the numbers. And a lot of systems will do that. You all rate, president pulls them together, figures out the average, and that's the evaluation. And I'm suggesting, that doesn't take advantage of the great opportunity to really move things effectively by having the conversation.
So if I may ask a clarifying question to help drive that discussion that you just described, would you ask that board members, when they're doing that initial rating, would you ask that they provide documentation/evidence of their score? So for example, let's say this is our board, I know there's 7 of us, whatever, and let's say I'm one of the people that brought distinguished. Would you ask that prior to clicking in, or however it is that we're doing this, that I compile okay, I have these 9 examples right here of when Dr. Keister went above and beyond to build self-esteem in staff and students through recognition programs and activities. Here are the 7 different activities and the 2 different recognition programs that I feel push him over to distinguish. Is that something you encourage us to do, or is that something where if we end up with a really wide variety of a big range, where there are large gaps, that then we would go back and pull that? What do you think a good expectation for us, a good professional expectation for us as board members should be? We get that data ahead of time, or is that something as an on-demand?
No, I think generally speaking, you'll have most of the evidence of things presented to you either through processes in the year or as part of the self-eval. You should know what those evidence and indicators are. If there's outside things that a person has to offer, then that's, I'm not saying you don't bring that to the table, but you don't want to base the evaluation on stuff nobody's seen or talked about. Most of that evidence ought to be there in front of everybody.
Thank you.
Yep.
I also have a question. This is Maria.
Yeah.
So when you're doing the rubric and you're filling out the information about it, you know, and we're supposed to come up with that rubric already completed. And then when we have discussion, you know, amongst each other, sometimes hearing the different perspectives and, you know, different opinions and just, you know, what others see that maybe others don't see, you know, sometimes you might get that urge to maybe change that rubric. Is that like valid to you know, if you had already completed it, to change it?
No, that's a very good question, and thank you for bringing that up. No, our perception on process is you bring that in as a draft. The only numeric rating that matters is the results of the collective conversation. Did that make sense? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so you're saying that it shouldn't be changed then? It's, you know, whatever is collectively produced, that's the end result?
Yep, and I can tell you, this is based on our work with a lot of legal counsel too. If for example, you all submit a summary survey, and that's designed as your evaluation, then that's all record. And so now there are 7 individual records of the evaluation. I don't believe that's consistent with governance, nor do most attorneys. What you want is the board's opinion of what the evaluation is. So when you come in with your paper, you might have in your mind on your paper a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or whatever it is. That's not the evaluation score. The evaluation score comes out of the conversation across the table of what they all are, because you could very well shift based on the conversation. And then that becomes the record. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, Dan. I'm trying to be respectful of time here. I get on a roll. So this is just an example of a common rating where you're just saying, right, needs improvement, meets or exceeds. I show this as an illustration that it's very difficult then on board members. I think that's one of the greatest frustration for board members, is knowing what in the world that means in objective terms. Now, having lots of indicators helps, but if you don't build that into a rubric of sorts, then it makes it really challenging for a board member. And it makes it equally frustrating for the superintendent who doesn't know what that means. You know, it feels great if I got all 3s, but in truth, that doesn't tell me anything about what they really thought or what was important to them, because I didn't get the benefit of the narrative that goes with it. So, next slide. Another example of how a board approached their ratings. Here, they were looking for a way to decide objectively what they were looking for. So imagine that you had a management expectation around staff, or let me see if I can think of a better example here. All right, so let's go back to the illustration where we talked about communicating with the. Well, no, don't go back in slides. I'll just bring it back up. Sorry. Let's just talk about engaging with the public. All right. So if that was an expectation, engaging meaningful with the public, sensitive to their input, you would expect that there's going to be brought to you as evidence systems and processes and routine practices that the superintendent is doing that demonstrate engagement in the public. I am doing coffees. I am in every civic group. I'm on the chamber board. I meet with constituency groups. I meet internally with staff, whatever those things are. And you can witness those by having people share conversations. I assume you'd have those reports coming to you, status things coming to you. You can verify those things are actually going on. And that board saw that in any of these operational things, we'd want to know that there are systems and processes there. If you tell me to hire only highly qualified staff, then I'm assuming there's going to be an organized system and process and a practice in place in which you've defined highly qualified staff. You as a board would have said, yep, that is reasonable. And so you're going to look for those things. And if you see them, then that's meeting expectations, right? There's a reasonable expectation that that's in place in the institution is going to happen.
Don, may I interrupt briefly just to make sure that
Yep.
I understand where you're going?
Yep.
Could you give us kind of a working definition of what is our lane and what is crossing over into something that is not our lane? Because I feel like the board should determine the what and the administration should determine the how. So if our what is we want you to only hire qualified staff, do we then get to go in and define, like, this is what that looks like, these 6 things, these 2 things, whatever that is?
Yep.
Can you kind of give us some boundaries of, yep, that's appropriate for a board to do, and no, now you're getting out of your lane?
Yep. Good question. So at its core, I define the lanes for board and administration, and we do a whole workshop on this too, but think of it as ends and means, the old characterization. Board's work is ends, identifying what the end in mind is, the large outcome on anything. It is entirely the superintendent and staff's job to figure out the means to get that done. Now, in any real life circumstance, at a minimum, the superintendent is going to bring to you systems and processes and practices that are going to reasonably accomplish those things. Because if you're writing the policy, his job is to translate that policy into practice. So he's going to tell you what that translation is. You have at that point, I think, a reasonable opportunity to shape it, to say, what about this? Or, tell me how you approach this. That's a much more meaningful conversation than having the board have to design the thing themselves, because it's not their, right? It's not their expertise or their background to do it, unless you all happen to be professional educators. But now saying that though, I do think when you identify a large expectation, yes, I do think it's okay for the board to set some parameters around that. To some extent, you want to give your executive and staff the broadest latitude to do what they need to do to get the job done. But, right, the broadest latitude to use their experience and expertise to design the means. But if you've got some parameters, low-hanging fruit would be, you can do what you need to do to get this done, but you're not going to do anything illegal. You're not going to do anything that violates assets of the districts. You're not going to do anything that sets the community on fire. You get the idea. But you want to leave it as broad as you can. I think it's easier for a board if the superintendent brings you, in effect, the translation of a policy, the system and process that goes with that. And then you just have a conversation about if you've got an issue with something or concerned about something, raise it and try to shape it, but not feel like in your committees, for example, you got to design the process yourself. You will hear me talk about in under evidence, that you do set some parameters for, if you say, that's what I talked about, the meaning of something. If you say, we want you to be fully engaged in the public, you're going to want to define what engagement means. So you're going to want to put some parameters and definition to those terms, yes. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay.
It does. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Next slide, Nan. Am I getting the hook at 6:30 here, Dan? Is that the plan? You're going to talk finance? Finance at the end of the day?
You can continue. Our board president said you can continue.
Okay. So here's your, we're getting there anyway. The Beloit process, which I think I included it on here because I didn't know if, since some of you are relatively new, and I'm sure you've had your hands full on all kinds of things with the transition here, not to mention the pandemic, but you've got a lot of really good elements in your process. So this whole business of setting goals for the coming year, again, I'd only encourage that some goals are bigger than a year, and they ought to be some permanent kinds of results you're always after, especially when it comes to outcomes for kids and expectations. But generally, you're going to kind of check in and review those. You've got here that you're going to verify beliefs and mission. I think that's an important step for you as a relatively new board and a new superintendent, is to check in on those important policies that you got in place. If you don't have clarity around ends and beliefs, then that's a good conversation to have, first and foremost. Pretty tough for Dan to figure out where he's going or how to get to someplace if he doesn't know where he's going. But that's a good part of the process for evaluation. Reviewing the job description, if that's a component of the evaluation, I think is always important, and make sure it's still relevant. Things change if you have a long-term superintendent. I think it's still good to go back and review expectations and policies. Trust is usually high when you've had somebody a long time, and that's probably even more reason to go back and check and make sure you're on the same page and not just taking things for granted. In January, you had this check-in, and again, you'll see on our recommendations for best practice, that ought to be at least 4 times a year, not counting the summative. A lot of people will do 6, and I'll talk a little bit about those sessions, what goes on. You've got the board evaluation and the final written here, and again, we just talked about some of the components of your survey draft that you would bring in as kind of a working document for a board member to bring to the table and have the group discussion. And then obviously you're communicating that instrument once it's done to the benefit of the community. But give me the next slide, Dan, please. So here are sort of identified best practices out of the governance literature. And I've only highlighted a few things that I think are things maybe to consider for insertion in your process. So you've got your annual focus meeting of sorts referenced. I think that's important. Typically boards will do that in the summer. This summer was an exception, but typically in the summer you've got some time to sort of reflect on, where you are, where you've been, what's next, what important things we need to do in the coming year. It's where you would set your agendas for the year on the things that are most important. But I'd insert these formative conversations deliberately. We call them quarterly. For obvious reasons, but in those, it's basically a status check. It's an opportunity to have a closed session conversation about how we doing. Dan's going to want to know where are we in terms of you reading our progress on important outcomes. Where are we in terms of expectations you have for my performance? He might have some status reporting on those things, some evidence for you. But importantly, it's where you build trust. And I'll just labor on that for a second, in that what's most important in a board superintendent relationship and to the benefit of the district is the trust between the board and the superintendent. And if you think about it, it's because you as a board, you might get to see him twice a month. If you've got committees, maybe a couple more times than that. Events perhaps, but in real serious work, a couple times, maybe 3 times a month if you got committees. On a daily basis, this person is going to be making decisions throughout the system and in the community. That's the job. And he's going to make those decisions based on his guiding principles, based on his values, based on his beliefs of what he believes your beliefs are. So the more you can talk about those things, the better. The more often he can say, look, here's the big rocks, here's the big challenges, here's what I'm thinking, and here's why. Here's why I think this is consistent with what our guiding principles are and what our values are. Let's talk about that. And the board's got to be willing to share back. And if necessary, if you've got real differing opinions, then you got to have some process to get to a reflection of the board as a whole. But that's where trust comes from. You want to know that when he's operating in the system, he's operating in a way that you think reflects your value system, which reflects the communities. So I'm suggesting that you literally talk about those things. And too often that's what's missing, I think, in board work with the superintendent. So enough about that. The summative, you do have the superintendent doing a self-reflection. I think that's critical. That's where a lot of that evidence, I think, to Megan's question earlier, will come from. You will have that up front throughout the year. And certainly, I like it if it can come at different times during the year. but rather than some huge report that's got to get done just for the summary evaluation. But evidence can be collected through the year. You're likely going to see good evidence in board meetings. If you think about when you get reports on systems and processes and programs, that's probably evidence towards some outcome, and Dan can show you the connection between them. Again, here's the part that we've discussed a little earlier about the independent review. I'm suggesting that comes in as kind of a working draft for you, and it guides the input to the whole board discussion, which is the critical part. They share their individual perspectives and then come up with a collective voice. Our suggestion is that you don't need to discuss every single item, but certainly if you've got a 3-point rating scale and you have an item that is less than 1.5, that probably is an item you want to discuss in a little bit more detail. What did people rate on that and why? Are we clear about what our questions or concerns might be? Likewise, a 2.5. What makes this a particular strength? Can we build on that strength? How do we all read this? Or an item that has quite a spread across the scale. So if you got a 3-point scale and you got 2 people in every level, let's talk about that. Why the difference here? Because again, the idea is that the board collectively has a picture of what they're after, and if they're not reading it the same, then you got to talk about that, because it could be that Dan's not reading it the correct way either. So those are the ones that I think in particular you would tease out to try to talk about. And then obviously, as you had in yours, the board president has the task and pleasure typically of conveying the board's beliefs. But I think you got to have everybody has an opportunity at the table to talk directly to the superintendent on feedback side. And that gets communicated ultimately. And Dan, in a good process, you'd have an opportunity to respond and then discuss that with the board. Again, the benefit of these quarterlies, you can be discussing, things that matter throughout the year, not just at that point. So, all right, that was kind of a quick fly through. This is just a sample statement, and we suggest this came out of a lot of the work of. For those of you who've maybe heard boards talk about coherent governance or Carver's policy governance, it's even in the key work of school boards and stuff that WSB does in terms of how you communicate the status of a superintendent as opposed to, again, numeric systems to go out in the public that they know even less about than you do. It's challenging enough for you at the table, but if you want the community to really understand where you're at, you want to, I think, have a narrative opportunity to say, here's where we're at. Here's where we are on the results we're after, because it reminds people the results you're after. Here are the things that are really working well, and here's some things we're going to work on. I think that's just a better message and more easily understood by the public. So, questions about any of that? I know you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So it makes sense for me that the administrator would bring a summative report for the formal kind of evaluation, but as you're recommending the smaller discussions happen, which I completely agree with. So let's say we go with 4. What should the administrator bring to those more casual sessions that is not the summative statement?
Well, that too is a discussion and a decision by the board about what they're looking for. I encourage boards not to make those too formal. For me, the idea is he would come in and give you a check-in for where he thinks things are at in the system relative to outcomes, relative to operational expectations. It might be a place where he can say, we've started doing X, Y, and Z, which fits with this expectation we have. So he could be sharing that. I don't know that it has to be an elaborate written report. I've discovered boards don't like that any more than the superintendent likes putting it together. So I think it's more conversational, and most importantly, it allows an opportunity effectively to ask the question, how are we doing? Do you have questions? Do you have concerns? For Dan to say, here are my biggest challenges. Particularly if you're in an institution, for example, that's undergoing a lot of change. Change almost always creates challenges, frustration, pushback. It'll create issues for board. You'll get complaints from community. You'll get confusion from people. That's a perfect opportunity because you have an expectation that this change is gonna happen. Perfect opportunity to talk about, here's what happens when there's change. Here's the challenges we're facing. Here's the likely frustrations we're going to cause. Here's the likely unhappiness we're going to cause. Here's how we're thinking about addressing that. Tell me what you think. Always trying to, again, reflect the kind of expectations you might have for how change is going to occur and how problems are going to get solved. So I wouldn't want to see it too formalized. It's a long way of saying, because I think you get lost in the report and you never get the conversation about what matters.
Thank you.
Other questions? Dan, anything from you or Kyle especially?
Can you summarize quickly then what are our first steps? So we're looking to have his tool ready to go so we can begin the is it something that Dr. Keyser should bring kind of ready, like these are the goals that he would like to work on, and then with some explanation of them, we have a discussion around those, and of course they would align with goals that the district has highlighted. So is that kind of where we go from here then?
Yep, I think that's reasonable, Kyle, and Dan, you can weigh in. But I think if he came with, hopefully the district, the board really should identify some, what I refer to as big rock sorts of results that you're after. You may already have those. If you don't, you're going to want to identify those, but you're not going to do that in a week. So it's probably easiest if Dan can bring a couple of goals, perhaps from his early work there, that the board would give a thumbs up on. You're also likely going to have some operational expectations for him. I think that you referred again to those as management. I don't know if there's much detail to that other than that label. You may take a look at the instruments that Dan has pulled out. You can use one of those. But then what I would suggest is your step, Kyle, is to go through the items of that instrument and have a conversation about what the item means to the board. So then he could go from there and suggest, here's the evidence then that we would use to demonstrate, right, that we're complying with that expectation. So it means I don't envision you'd complete the evaluation next week, but you might have the conversation about clarifying goals, giving a thumbs up if you want to one of those instruments, and then either at that meeting or a subsequent meeting talking about what those items on that instrument mean to you. I think one of the instruments was only really a couple pages, probably not insurmountable as a place to start, and have a conversation about what the item means. He can probably come back to you, or you may talk about what kind of evidence are you looking for. That's the critical part. How are we going to know, right, if this item is being met? And you're going to want to clarify, if you've got a rating scale, what the distinction is between a 1, a 2, and a 3, or however many you have. So I think you can do a lot of that work in your next meeting, and you could probably get to some semblance of an evaluation in another meeting or two. But I think if you did it next meeting, I'm not sure you'd know what you're evaluating.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John, for providing this information to all of us, including myself. And I know that through the first year Superintendent's Academy, you briefly touched upon some of the highlight pieces to that. Only thing I would add to the conversation would be going back to, I think Amy brought that up in terms of the larger conversation of the board and the superintendent conversation, and knowing to the degree where that relationship is when we're having the conversation around the instrument. So I think she raises a really good point in the conversation of when we want to clarify expectations, clarifying the ends. To what degree have we clarified the ends that work can get done? That was just more of a comment, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the critical work of the board, is being clear about what those ends are. Now, you don't have to do them all in one setting, but start with something that's, pretty much a consensus among everybody relative to students. That's a place to start. And maybe a few things that are important in terms of their expectations of your practice, Dan. I think that's a good enough place to start, and then to talk about what are the evidences, objectives, right, metrics that they're going to use to evaluate those.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, it doesn't look like any. Thank you very much, Dr. Bales, for being with us tonight and walking us through this process. We very much appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yep, you bet. Hope it was helpful. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Okay. The next agenda item is a workshop on school finance. So we have with us Dale Knapp, the Director of Research and Analytics for Wisconsin Counties Association. Thank you, Dale, for being with us tonight and waiting while we got to you. I think this is your third or fourth time presenting to Beloit. And it's very beneficial and helpful. Really breaks down school finance, which is something not my favorite thing ever, into easier to understand pieces.
Yeah, so this is my third time presenting to Beloit. Glad to be here tonight. Now I'm not sure. This is actually the first time I have actually used Google Meet, so I don't know how to do the presentation. Can I share my screen, or let me just see here.
Yep.
In the bottom right, there should be a present now.
There we go. Okay. So first of all, you're probably wondering why somebody from the Wisconsin Counties Association is presenting to you on school finance. I spent 18 years with the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, a public policy research group out of Madison, and I spent a lot of time on a variety of issues, but my background is in economics and in particular education and human capital. And so I was drawn to the public education side of what we did. And so I did a lot with K-12 school finance over the years and became somewhat of an expert in it. It's quite complicated, although I really enjoyed doing it. A couple of years ago, the Taxpayers Alliance merged with the Public Policy Forum out of Milwaukee, and at that time, I had known the head of the Counties Association for quite a number of years, and he asked me to come on board and start a new research organization at the Counties Association, and so that's what I've been doing for the past couple of years. Still love to do the school finance thing, but we're spending lately the time. What we've been focusing on is Wisconsin's demographic problem, and in particular, the rural demographic problem that we have. I have a few pieces in the pipeline kind of on school finance, but they're going to be put off here a little bit with everything that's going on. So what I'm going to do, school finance in Wisconsin is, for me, it's interesting. For most people, it's boring and complicated, and it is complicated. So we're going to walk through school finance here in Wisconsin, starting at sort of the highest level, and then sort of working our way down into some more detail. So, as I said, first of all, school finance is complicated. We know that. So we're going to start with this broad overview, hone down to how school aids work. For the most part, what I'm going to do to give you a sense of how things work and how districts are different, and yet in some ways they end up being the same. We're going to do some comparisons of Beloit with Beloit Turner and the state. That will really help highlight some important concepts. We're going to then go and talk about the revenue limit layer, which is really important, and give you a brief history of a really brief history of that, and how we got to kind of where we are.
Dale?
So, yes.
Sorry. On the screen that's you're projecting, we're showing your presentation view, not the actual slides.
All right, here, let me just change this. Let's go back to... we'll just go back to here. Do it this way. Okay. So now do you see the... Okay. All right, good. All right, so let's talk about the big picture, the view from very high up. School funding essentially involves federal aid, property taxes, and state aid. I mean, those are the three primary revenue sources at the big picture. Now, there are some other revenues that districts have, various student fees, et cetera. They account for just a tiny percent of the overall funding. So the funding of districts are in these three big pots. We're not going to spend really much time on federal aid. That's sort of, it's very distinct to district characteristics. So we'll talk about it, and we'll look at where Beloit is compared to other districts. But really, what's really important is to think about the property tax and the state aid and how those kind of work together. So if we start at this level, this very high level, we can go one level deeper. And in particular, there's two kinds of state aid. By far, the biggest pot of state aid is general or what's called equalization aid. That's the aid that works through a formula that attempts to equalize property tax rates in districts, and we'll kind of get to what that means. And general equalization aids, there's no restrictions on those dollars. They can be used for anything. The second type of aid are categorical aids. Now, these are and we'll get to a little bit more detail, but these are generally aids that go for a particular purpose. They fund special education, they fund busing, they fund sort of a variety of programs. And so when you get those kinds of aids, they have to be spent in very particular areas. So they're restricted in that sense. There is one categorical aid that we'll get to that began in 2013 that is more like the equalization aid in that it's unrestricted. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's the two types of aids. And so what's really important here then is for school aid, your property taxes and your general equalization aid together, that is what are called revenue limits. That is the total the revenue that the state limits in the revenue limit law. We'll get to that. So what and the revenue limit, the sum of the property taxes and general aid are about 75 to 80% of a district's revenues. So again, that's really where the big bang for your comes in. That's really what's driving generally your school funding. So let's talk about in a little bit more detail. So the general aid. So originally these were called equalization aids, if you go way back, and they're it's a big pot of money that's run through a formula, and again was meant to equalize property tax rates, and we'll get to that. So that if Beloit has, essentially the idea is if Beloit has if Beloit spends $10,000 per student and Beloit Turner spends $10,000 per student, but Beloit Turner has more property value than property value per student than Beloit does, the formula is meant to give Beloit enough aid so that both those districts can have the same tax rate for that level of spending. Okay. It's now they now call it general aids because after that equalization, there's a whole lot of deductions and things that come out of there, and so it doesn't quite equalize as well anymore. So when you combine all that, they've changed the name kind of to general aid, but it's, most people still call it the equalization aid formula. The amount of general aid that you get depends on a couple of things. It depends on the pot of money, so how much the state decides to fund that. It depends on how much you spend per student, and it depends on how much property value you have per student. And it also depends on what everybody else is spending and everybody else's property value per student. So if there are big changes in property value per student in a couple of large districts, that can trickle through the whole formula and really change the distribution of aid. So the biggest factors are your spending and your property values, but there's a lot of factors that work through there. The aid is based on what you spent the prior year. So when you're getting your equalization aid, it's funding your district this year based on what you spent last year. Okay, so there's a year delay in getting that aid. And we talked about the shared same cost, same tax rate. The categorical aid, again, offset particular costs, special ed, transportation, with the exception of the per pupil. So what does Beloit look like? The Department of Public Instruction does not have the 2019-2020 amounts out yet. They'll have them out next spring. But this, in terms of the absolute dollar amounts, it's going to change. In terms of kind of the ratios, it'll be about the same. So on a per student basis, Beloit's biggest revenue source is state equalization aid at $8,940 per student. The second biggest is the property tax at about $23.71 per student. State categorical aids and federal aid are about the same amount. And then again, as we mentioned, there's these miscellaneous revenues that the district collects. I think what's interesting, again, now is when you compare Beloit to the state average and to Beloit Turner, you'll see significant differences. First of all, you'll see that Beloit, because of its relatively low property values per student, gets much more equalization aid per student than does the average district in the state, $5,400, and almost $2,000 more than Beloit Turner, because Beloit Turner has more property value. And Beloit relies less on than the property tax than the state average and Beloit Turner. Now, what's going to be really important, and one of the things this can be, especially for somebody new to school finance, this can be a little bit confusing because you look at school tax rates and you say, well, no, wait a minute, our school tax rate isn't half that of Beloit Turner or the state average. And we'll get to that. You want to really separate the school tax rate from your reliance on the property tax. And we'll see that the way that, again, we'll walk through the way the formula works, you're going to end up with very similar school tax rates. And as you see, Beloit spending is not much different from the state average, and slightly higher, about $1,000 per student higher than Beloit Turner. That difference, though, that $1,000 difference, is almost totally, accounted for in higher federal aid. The district gets about $1,700. Beloit Turner gets about $900, and that's usually that federal aid is because of poor students, et cetera, in the district. So let's add the layer. So these revenue limits, and as we mentioned before, so the revenue limits are the sum of the property tax and state equalization aid. First question, so the question first is why do we have these revenue limits? Well, they were started in 1993-94. And really, to some degree, their history, or what led up to that implementation, really goes back to the 1970s with a state law which changed the how teachers unions and school districts negotiated. Essentially, there were strikes, and we came up with a bargaining law in which, when the two sides couldn't come together, they went before a arbiter and this binding arbitration, the arbiter picked one side or the other. And through the late 70s and early 80s, the teachers' unions were winning most of the arbitration cases. And without any limits on property taxes, et cetera, any gains for, in terms of or increased costs due to the binding arbitration really had to be funded through property taxes. And so you saw school property taxes going up 7, 8, 9% a year throughout most of the 80s and the early 90s. By the early 90s, there was a lot of uproar, among citizens about the rising school taxes, property taxes in general, particularly school taxes. And so they really put pressure on the governor and the state legislature to do something. And so they came up with this compromise in which the state would fund 2/3 of school costs. So there would be a big increase in that equalization aid, but the increases each year were going to be capped by state law. Originally, there were only inflationary adjustments each year on this per student basis. So your revenue limit was growing at the rate of inflation. What we saw early on, and what a lot of analysts saw early on, was the commitment to 2/3 funding for the state was probably not sustainable, particularly because Medicaid costs were growing at 7, 8, 9, 10% a year and eating up a bigger and bigger portion of the state budget. And there's never really been much of an appetite for increased taxes at the state level. So eventually what happened was we got rid of the inflationary adjustments. And beginning in 2010, the annual adjustments in the revenue limits are a budgetary decision every other year with the state budget. So they don't reflect inflation. They reflect what the state thinks they can afford to increase the aid by. And it reflects what the legislature thinks that citizens will tolerate in terms of property tax increases. Because remember, when the revenue limits go up, essentially you're allowing districts to raise their property taxes by a certain amount. It's capped, but so we've seen of late, we've seen, since about 2013, for the most part, we've seen almost no increase in the revenue limit. With a Republican governor and the Republican legislature very much wanting to hold down property taxes, they've not only really restricted municipal and county property taxes, but school property taxes as well. And so that's one of the challenges really that districts have faced now for going on a decade. This part here is really important. So the revenue limits are calculated based on a 3-year average of students. And it's done purposely because when the state created this, they didn't want districts to have to immediately adjust to declining enrollment. So remember, because these are calculated on a per student basis, when you have fewer students, that total revenue limit is going to drop because you have fewer students. Even though the per student might go up, the total amount is going to stay flat or possibly decline. By calculating it on a 3-year average, it slows that decline. So it gives districts that have declining enrollment a little bit of time to try to adjust. One of the things that, one of the really important things in terms of this revenue limit, which I've been telling districts for years, is you don't want to become a declining enrollment district. And the reason is that, you know, if you average, just say you average 25 kids a class in the district, and you lose 50 kids in a year all across all the grade levels, that would be the equivalent of 2 teachers if you think about it in classes, or increase in class size. But because it's over multiple grades, you really can't, you know, adjust that way. The way I view it is school district costs are lumpy to some degree. So if you lose 25 students, you're not laying off a teacher. But if you lose students gradually over quite a number of years, you have to really start cutting costs. And if you look to northern Wisconsin and the struggles that many of those districts have had in terms of school finance and programming issues because of declining enrollment, you'll see that you really don't want to become a declining enrollment district. And I was looking at Beloit yesterday as I was thinking about this, and I do see that over the last couple of years, you have gone from, you know, a growing district to a declining enrollment district, and so it's something that you have little control over. There's not a lot of control districts have. The district that I live in, Stoughton, went through this around 2005, and we had a number of issues. And one of the things that I recommend to school boards, especially if your enrollment starts stagnating, have conversations with municipal officials. Economic development, a growing population benefits everybody, and you know, as a district, you don't have a lot of control over the number of students. But if the community has a somewhat of a pro-growth attitude, and it doesn't have to be rapid growth, you know, that's going to help the school district because it allows you to, at a minimum, maintain your funding. So I think that's something that's very important. And what we'll see as we continue through this a little bit is that there's another piece of school funding that's becoming more important that's also tied to student numbers. So, you know, that's something that's really important. So let's dig in a little bit deeper to state aid. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I'm going to try to keep it again at a higher level. But let's talk about how the equalization formula works to some degree. So the formula is based on what are called shared costs. Effectively, it's your your per student costs that aren't already funded, so that aren't funded with federal aid and aren't funded with categorical aids. So, you know, a lot of your special education costs, or I shouldn't say a lot anymore, some of your special education costs, transportation costs are funded with state aid, possibly federal aid. Those get taken out. Everything else is part of what this shared cost, what the state is willing to share the funding. And they fund it at 3 different levels. So the first $1,000 of shared costs, almost every district gets some of that aid. There are some districts that have extraordinarily high property values per student, $2 million, $2.5 million per student, that get almost no aid, but there are very few. But so pretty much everybody gets fully funded at that level. That second level then looks at your costs from $1,000 up to essentially the average spending in the state. And through this formula then, based on your property values, the state picks up a portion of those costs. And then all of your costs over that amount, again, the state has another formula in there that it picks up a different share of your costs. Now, the difference between the second and third levels, any aid that you get at the first level is guaranteed. The second and third levels aren't guaranteed. For Beloit, they are. For Beloit being a low-value district, you're going to get aided at all 3 levels. A district like Middleton, a suburb of Madison, who has relatively high values, they get aided at that second level, but their costs that are over the state average actually means they take aid dollars away from them. So there's a disincentive for a district like Middleton to spend more because they actually get aid taken away. So this formula, it works its way through based on all of the 420 districts in the state, based on all of their spending, all of their aid. It cycles through and calculates an aid amount for every district. And just to show you how it works, a lot of times the first time when I show this to people, they're actually quite amazed that it works as well as it does. So these are our Beloit and Beloit Turner's 2017-18 costs. Okay, so again, prior year, this is the 2018-19 aid formula based on costs from the prior year. So notice they're very similar costs. The costs already funded through federal aid, through state aid, et cetera. That's so when you get down to it, 2017-18 shared costs for the 2 districts are almost identical. But Beloit only has $188,000 per student in property value. Beloit Turner has $391,000. Okay. So if we didn't have this equalization formula, Beloit would need a tax rate of about $55 per $1,000 of property value to fund that amount per student. Beloit Turner would need a rate half that amount. And that's why the state comes in and works through this formula. With this formula, Beloit gets $8,700 per student. Beloit Turner gets just under $7,000. Beloit has $1,600 per student funded through the property tax then. Beloit Turner has about $3,300. But because Beloit has much less property, so when you calculate the cost funded by the property tax by equalized value, you get a tax rate of about $8.60. Beloit is exactly the same. So the formula, the original equalization formula is actually pretty amazing in that it was structured in a way that if two districts have the same shared costs per student and wildly different property values, they're going to end up with the same tax rate.
Dale?
Yes.
I have a question. This is John Wong.
Yes.
Are the property values based upon residential and commercial, or is it just residential?
It's all property values, all taxable property values. So it's commercial, residential, everything that pays a property tax.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yep. The only the only property that's temporarily not counted is property that's in a tax incremental finance district. Okay, so the properties that are in tax incremental finance districts still they pay a tax at the same rate, but it goes to the city to pay off the infrastructure that they put in, that their costs in the district. When the district expires in 20 years or 25, whenever it's going to expire, then it goes on to the tax rolls and in terms of school taxes. But it is all property. Yeah. Now, as I mentioned before, this is this pure equalization at work. Because over the years, again, they have they've funded certain charter schools in Milwaukee. They funded that as a deduction from your school aid. And there are a few other additions and deductions. It doesn't work out exactly the same anymore because those are all disequalizing because everybody gets deducted at the same rate. So it doesn't quite work out. It still works out fairly well. And Wisconsin's equalization formula has really been recognized nationally a number of times for how well it works in equalizing tax rates among poor and rich districts. So what are the imperfections? The imperfections are, one is timing. So it's based on prior year spending, but paid out in the current year. And that is tied with current year revenue limits and at times can create some small quirks, so quirky results. They don't have a big impact, but because of that timing, there are some odd things sometimes that happens. As I mentioned, there's other programs funded through the aid formula that can create issues. At the end here, I'm going to talk about one that I think is going to become a really important issue down the road. It's a small issue now, but it's going to get bigger. And remember, it's a zero-sum game. So if the state adds money to the equalization formula, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to get some of that. It's funny because if you ever look, every summer, the state puts out its preliminary numbers in terms of aid to school districts. And the Wisconsin State Journal usually puts out an article on it. And one of the things you find is even when the state increases the amount of funding, you have, maybe half, maybe 60% of districts are getting increases in aid, and half or 40% are actually losing aid. So it's just because the state adds money doesn't mean everybody gets a piece of it. Again, it depends on everything that's going on in the formula, what's happening with your costs, your property values, and everybody else's. So when the state says that they're adding money, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to get a piece of the pie. It does mean, though, that equalization is still going to, for the most part, work in that if you spend the same amount as everybody else, you're going to have roughly the same property tax. Oh, okay. I know what I was doing here. So we back here we had this equalization, how it worked out perfectly. Instead, if we look at so in this case I didn't include any of the deductions. So this table shows what really happens, and so this is using general aid. So it's after all of these deductions to give you a sense of what happens. After all of the deductions and after the entire formula works through, you have the same costs, et cetera, but notice Beloit ends up with a higher tax rate than Beloit Turner because property poor districts get disadvantaged by any deduction that is proportional, that is proportional across districts, that doesn't take into account property value, such as particularly the charter schools in Milwaukee and the funding for state and Racine private choice, and we're going to get to that. So it works pretty well, but it's not perfect anymore. You want to be aware of so the revenue limits, again, are really important because that's the biggest chunk of your funding. But you want to be aware of the categorical numbers. And again, when you looked at Beloit gets a little bit more of their funding through categoricals than other districts. And there's a long list of programs in terms of the categorical aids. About $1.2 billion in 2019-20. Again, special education is the biggest. And then you get down to the achievement gap reduction and transportation, and the dollar amounts get smaller and smaller. But there, you want to make sure that you're getting what you should be getting in each of these programs. The new one I shouldn't say it's not new anymore. It's relatively new, but it's become really, really big. Is what's called per pupil aid. So in the 2011-13 budget, state budget, in order to balance the budget, the state legislature and the governor cut a lot of school aid, cut a lot of municipal aid, county aid, et cetera. And limited revenue limit increases to basically nothing. And in the budgets that followed, they were doing the same thing. And what they decided to do in 2012-13 to help districts somewhat, instead of increase their revenue limit, they were going to give them a one-time funding of $50 per student. Now, if you follow state government very much, one-time funding almost never is one-time funding. It generally turns into permanent funding, and it did. So that one-time funding of $50 per student became permanent in the following budget, and it has grown ever since, so that in 2019-20, it was $742 per student. So again, remember, go back to what I said about how important student counts are. That $50 per student in 2012-13, while was important at the time because revenue limits weren't going up, it's much more important now at $742 per student and growing. And it really changed how schools were funded. It really became, it's becoming more and more disequalizing. So this chart shows the teal bars here are the annual increases in revenue limits. That's primarily how schools were getting more funding over the years. There were some increases in categorical aids along the way, but the primary increase was by increasing the revenue limit. So by 2009, you had a $274 per student increase in every district's revenue limit, roughly the rate of inflation. As we said, starting in 2010, we got rid of the inflation amount and it was statutorily set, and then we saw the big cut. And since then, these teal bars here are the increases in the revenue limits. The way to think about that is that those are increases that are equalizing in terms of district spending and district affordability to some degree. The orange are just, again, outside the revenue limits. And so increasingly what we're seeing is school funding, increases in school funding being funded outside the revenue limits. And in some degree, that is becoming a little bit disequalizing. It's still, this portion is still, overall is still much bigger, but it's a little bit of a troubling trend. The bigger issue is, we're not even back to increases in terms of where we were in 2009. 2020, the total was 263, and we know district costs have gone up significantly since then. So this whole period has been a period of districts throughout the state cutting costs, cutting staff to some degree, trying to stay within their budgets. So as I said, and again, I just really want to emphasize this: your revenue in so many ways depends on your enrollment. Beloit, again, is just beginning to turn into losing students. The state as a whole has a children problem to a degree, in that the number of school-aged kids is down significantly throughout the state. So every district, not every, but almost every district is dealing with this on some level. Again, you don't want to let it get out of hand if you can, because then you're fighting a real difficult battle with revenues and costs as your revenues really get squeezed. So I talked about this, where this is having a little bit of a disequalizing impact on school funding. I think one of the change that they made in 2015 has the potential to be even more disequalizing in the long term. So we have 3 school choice programs in the state. The one in Milwaukee, which has been around since the 90s. The one in Racine, which was started about 10 years ago. And then the statewide program, which was started about 6 or 7 years ago. The Racine, so the Milwaukee school choice funding is totally separate, and that affects Milwaukee the way that's funded. It doesn't really affect everybody else. Racine and the statewide program originally were funded with just a lump sum of state dollars. So depending on how many students were in the program, the state set aside tax dollars that they paid the choice districts with. Beginning in 2015-16, they changed how they were funding it, and I to this day I'm still not sure what the reasoning was behind it. So what they're doing now is, when you have students in your district that are participating in the statewide choice program, you get to count them, even though they're not going to school in the Beloit district. You get to count them as students in the equalization aid formula. Okay. What does that do? Well, if you have more students, if you have more students per whatever your equalized property values are, it makes you look poorer in terms of the formula. At this point, for most districts, the differences aren't large. The one exception is Racine. The Racine program is fairly large. And so when Racine's choice students get put into the equalization formula, they now look roughly 10% poorer on a property value basis than they would be if you were only looking at the students that go to the Racine district. So because they look poorer, they get more aid. and that cycles through all of the districts in the state. And I started working on a project in my last year at the Taxpayers Alliance, and it's not easy, but trying to get a sense of what that difference was. And what you see is that it really is beginning to change the equalization formula, and again, becoming a little bit more disequalizing. In pure number terms, the statewide choice program is still relatively small compared to public schools. But if it grows and if it continues to grow significantly, this is going to have a fairly significant impact on some districts in terms of the distribution of aid. And again, it to a great degree, it becomes more disequalizing. And I think that's that's something that we should be concerned about, given the high grade that we generally get for our formula. I don't think we want to continually erode at the really good equalization formula that we have, the one that has worked really to a great degree for a long time. So I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on, and is going to has a chance to become a growing issue. And again, for a district like Beloit that relies on state aid to that great degree, the more disequalizing it becomes, it becomes a real challenge for a district like yours. And that's one of the school projects that I've got in the hopper that hopefully I'm going to be able to get out here within the next year or something or so. So I do think it's important, and it's important for policymakers to really understand the impacts of what they're doing, because it does have long-term impacts. So with that, I'll open it up if anybody has questions or on anything. I know there's a lot there.
Dale, I have a couple of questions. First of all,
Yeah.
going back to one of the slides that you showed, let's see, is this 19, where you talk about the 187 districts received less aid in 2018, and of those, 76% had declining enrollment. Do we have any idea, and maybe Joanne, I don't know, I know she's on the call as well, I don't know if she would have information on this as well. I don't recall seeing in our budget, I mean, for some bizarre reason, it seems as though our funding, or at least the money that we've been receiving, has continued to stay level or go up, even though we've had declining enrollment over the course of the last, I'm going to say, 3 to 5 years. Do you have anything on that, or have you?
Sure. Again, because there are some buffers. So there's in the aid formula, there is a sort of temporary buffer that slows down the loss of aid if you're a declining enrollment district. So there are some buffers in both the revenue limit and the aid formula. So you won't, when you start seeing declining enrollment, you won't see it show up in right away. And in 2020, the state allowed revenue limits to go up $175, and they added, and I don't remember the number now, but they added a fairly significant amount to the aid formula, which will help you. So if the state continues to add to the aid formula, that will limit your, that will help to generally limit your decline in terms of the dollar amounts. But given their past history, I don't think zero is the norm anymore. But I think given the especially when you look at state budget problems for the next biennium, if I'm a school district, I'm not expecting much in terms of increases in equalization aid. So I think that the next 2 years are going to be tough. If you continue to decline, my guess is that you'll start to see that decline in aid. Beloit is a district that, because of where you are, so property poor districts are, because of the nature of the formula, are also buffered a little bit in terms of the decline. It's just the way the formula works. If you had the enrollment declines that I've seen over the past few years, and you were a relatively high value district, you would have probably already seen the decreases. Essentially what the formula says is, if you rely a lot already on the property tax, so if you're a high value district, you rely a lot on the property tax, when your enrollment declines, effectively, it's not exactly this, but effectively it says, well, you can afford to increase property taxes to some degree, and so you lose more. A district like Beloit that doesn't rely overall on the property tax very much, a small increase in that total property tax amount can be a big percentage change. And so essentially what the formula does is, because you're a property poor district, it sort of naturally kind of cushions the decline to some degree.
Dale,
Yep.
this is Dan Kaiser. Is there still a part of the formula, declining enrollment exemption, that factors into the membership count, which feeds into the formula?
There's a declining enrollment exception. It's an annual 1 year exception. So it cushions you for that 1 year, but then your base becomes lower the next year, essentially. So if you continue to decline, it'll keep ratcheting you down. If you decline and then start back up, essentially you're kind of okay. But each of those are 1 year exceptions. So if you continue to decline, you get that exception, and then the next year you get another 1 year for whatever that decline is. But your base is lower, essentially.
Thank you.
Amy has the next question.
Dale, thank you for presenting for us. As we're beginning the school year, I know I'm starting to realize that there are certain governmental criteria or restrictions on, for example, how we do our food program. Are there similar rules around categorical aid? Specifically, you had a slide that said categorical aid, and then it was typically offset particular costs, and you had special ed and transportation. Are there governmental rules surrounding who can receive transportation? And the specific reason that I ask is, for example, we don't provide transportation for all of our high school students. is that a governmental kind of restriction, or is that more of a district decision?
It sounds like that's probably a district decision. So the state pays a certain dollar amount per. Well, there's categories of distances that depending on travel, but so the state will pay for all of, or will reimburse for your busing, transportation for all of those students. It sounds like it's probably a district decision. One of the challenges there has been actually in a number of these programs, the state says they will pay X percent of various costs, but because the reimbursable amounts are so big, everything gets prorated, so you don't get what the statutory amount says. You get some prorated amount. But each program's a little bit different in terms of what the requirements are to get the dollars, in terms of what you're using them for. So every program's a little bit different and has different requirements. And the DPI does a really good job of helping with that in terms of what for each program, what you need to really be careful about.
Is there a section on DPI's website that kind of breaks down what the criteria around certain categories of aid, like transportation or food, etc.? That's a good question. I will tell you, one of the challenges, I use a lot of the state websites for information. One of my challenges is that every 3 or 4 years, it seems like, they decide to redo their website because they think it'll be more user-friendly, and so now you don't know where everything is. The best thing to do would be, there is if you do a web search for Department of Public Instruction School Financial Services, okay, and then at that point there will be, I think it's about us, and it'll tell you who the experts are on each of the various programs. And they're very helpful. The best bet is figure out who the person is in terms of categoricals, or it might be very specific, and just give them a call. They've always been very helpful. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Amy, you can also, this is Joanne, sorry. You can also go right to DPI's website, and in the search bar, if you put in categorical aids, it will take you to that section, and it'll start listing all the different types, and you can drill down into it to get more information on each of those groups.
Thank you, Joanne.
No problem.
Okay, Maria and then John.
Thank you so much for the information. A lot of numbers and, a lot of different things to understand. So, thinking of the future, and just because there's different events that, will probably affect the school district of Beloit funding. So we're going to have a charter school that will be opening soon, which that would probably mean that we're going to have a decrease in food fuel assistance. So with that being said, I know there's going to be some kind of impact to the funding of the school. But then we're also, anticipating that there's going to be a casino coming through Beloit, which will most likely increase the values of the properties. Can you weigh out, how is that going to, I don't know, like what would be the impact, that we can expect as far as funding, with those two things happening? And I don't know if this is maybe not a question for this, but if you could lay out on that, that would be great.
So is the charter school, is that being chartered through the Beloit district?
No, it's not.
Okay. So if it's outside the district, that's again, because students count, that's so important, that will have an impact. I can't tell you exactly what that's going to be, but there would be an impact there. The casino, if that comes, sort of you want to sort of think about that in two ways. One is, if you think about it in terms of property values, and if it adds to development and increases property values, because of the equalization formula, that really shouldn't have an impact on district finances at all. So the more essentially the more property value there is, the more it can support a higher property tax levy without changing the rate. And so the less aid you'll get. And so it will not really affect your finances. If it brings development and families to the city, again, more students, then that would have a positive effect on your finances. So to the extent, for school districts, the way school districts, sort of the way in general, the way you should think about development is that in terms of property values, et cetera, it's not going to change the amount of money that you get. It's going to change the mix in terms of state aid and property taxes, but it won't change the amount. What development can do, though, is, bring families to the city, to the district, to keep your classrooms full, and that will help your funding. So for districts, the key is about families and about students. That's how you maintain your funding.
Thank you.
Dale, I have a question that's probably more relevant with today's environment, and I guess it's just out of curiosity. With the COVID situation the way it is, and realizing that the funding that comes from the state, it's coming from, I'm guessing, sales taxes, other types of revenue sources that the state collects throughout the year. Yeah. And if we see, which we likely will, a drastic decrease in this, is there a potential threat, since we are a state aid dependent district more so than others, is there risk that we could see funding cuts at the educational level throughout the state, and therefore the impact could be greater to the school district of Beloit than it would be others?
I get my answer to that would be, so there's definitely a risk to school aids. So one of the as the economist for the Counties Association, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on is helping counties try to get a handle on what's going on with their county sales taxes, because it's an important part of their budget. One of the things that's been very surprising is sales tax collections are down much less than we really anticipated. They're still down, but not as bad as we anticipated. And that's, I think, due to the the federal stimulus payments, the $1,200 and the $600 per week unemployment boost. That sort of helped maintain spending. If the federal government doesn't come to some agreement on continuing something, my worry is that we're going to see the sales tax really take a hit in the second half of this year. But I think in the end, we're going to see a real difficult budget for the state come next spring. What schools have to worry about, and this is something that I've been telling school districts for 20 years. The school aid formula, the equalization aid, school aids in general, are the biggest general purpose revenue, sales tax, income tax funded program the state has. So when the state is looking, where are we going to cut? They often look at where are the big pots of money. So in that sense, school funding, I think, there is a risk there. Now, where there's a little bit less risk than there is historically, because we have a very education-friendly governor. So I think he will. I don't think he will allow big cuts to school funding. That said, at a minimum, I think you're probably looking at pretty much no increases. That at this point, I would say at no increases. I don't think Beloit would be hurt any worse than anybody else, unless they make cuts to some of the categorical programs that Beloit uses to a higher degree than other districts. And I think that's highly unlikely. So I think my view at this point, and this is my view of what's going to happen next year, changes almost daily, because we're in uncharted waters here, and what's going on with the economy, et cetera, it's really hard to figure out. But I think we're going to have a challenging budget. I think you just plan for very little increase or no increase in state aid, and there's going to be probably no increase in revenue limits. So there's going to be some pain, but I think it's going to be pretty much equal throughout the state. The exceptions are districts that may be able to get referenda passed. I think that's going to be a challenge, but so they may be better off. But I think generally it's going to, any cuts or stagnation in increases will be fairly evenly felt throughout the state. School districts have been facing these challenges for, again, a decade now in terms of funding, and I think the next 2 years is just going to be more of the same for the most part.
Thank you.
So I think if anybody is watching home or any of us who are sitting here, if we're thinking about our household budgets, and we knew that there was uncertainty coming next year, our instinct would be to start saving now and kind of prepare for that. But my understanding of school finance is that the opposite is true. We want to spend everything we have this year, because then it's taken out of the formula in future years, correct? So outsiders looking into district finances, it would not be irresponsible of us to spend everything we have, perhaps ordering things ahead of time, not knowing what's coming. So I guess my question really is, in school finance, it's almost the opposite of how you would manage your your household finances and budgeting, correct?
Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be that depends. So if you're Beloit, and I guess this, so if you're Beloit and you get aided at all three of those levels that we talked about in terms of equalization, yeah, you get a little bit more aid if you spend more this year. If you spend, everything that you were budgeting and maybe more, yes. If you're Middleton, again, high property value, you don't necessarily want to do that because the more you spend, the less aid you're going to get. But these are, I guess my point with that though would be, these are short-term considerations because in the long term, that's all going to kind of equal out. So yes, you would benefit in terms of aid next year. But what that would mean, again, because that aid is tied into that revenue limit formula, all it does would mean that your property taxes are a little bit lower than they would have been. And then the following year, they might go up again. So you might see a little bit of volatility in that. But again, because of that equalization formula, all you're doing by spending more this year is changing the property tax aid, equalization aid mix for next year a little bit. Because what matters for your total funding next year is the sum of aid and property taxes. So all you're doing is changing that mix a little bit. So there's really not an advantage to spending all you have. No. And I do think that, school districts, municipalities, counties, et cetera, the state, oftentimes we don't do enough long-term thinking. In the situation now, there's so much going on in the short term that we have to focus on that, and I get that. But I think we also have to really think about long-term strategies. What puts us in the best position financially for the long term? And again, I think that unfortunately goes back to making sure that we keep our classrooms full to some degree, because that's in Wisconsin, that's where that's what the dollars are tied to.
Okay, thank you. John, go ahead.
Yeah, thinking long term, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I think that sometimes the focal point is too much on the short term, and that our job as a board is supposed to be looking much longer term. But with that in mind, can you address, or I should bring up or discuss how referendums work and how our aid is impacted by this? Because I know I was very involved in the referendum back in 2011, 2012. And I think it's very important for the public to understand that, like the $70 million that we raised or that we went to a referendum for, how much of that actually was affected by or paid for by local taxpayers versus from the state.
Sure. So to exceed the revenue limits, again, you have to go to referendum. One of the things I will say is, early on after revenue limits were passed and into state law, and the state promoted that they were funding 2/3 of school costs, there were a number of districts that went out and sold their referenda on the fact that the state was going to pick up 2/3 of the cost, and you only had to pick up 1/3 of the cost. And that wasn't true. It was really a misunderstanding of, and I don't necessarily think it was an intentional misunderstanding, but it was a misunderstanding of what's really going on. Yes, the state funds right now. The state funds it's about 65% or something of those school costs. But in terms of the referenda, every district's different. And I purposely went to this page where there's these 3 levels of aid. What matters in terms of who pays for what at a referenda is how much you are aided at this 3rd level. Because think about it, so right now if your shared costs are $12,000, okay, so you're getting aided at $2,300 over this at that 3rd level rate, right? So whatever that percentage is, state funding versus local funding, that's really the property tax share and the state aid share. And Beloit is going to be very different than Middleton. When Middleton went to referendum, I don't remember how many years ago, I think it passed. Property taxpayers there were paying 120% of the referendum cost. In other words, they were paying a premium because they're a high value district. So every dollar that they spend over that 3rd level into that 3rd level, they get aid taken away. So for them to spend $1 million cost taxpayers $1.2 million or something like that, whatever that percentage was. For Beloit, that's not the case. Beloit gets more aid at that level. So you can go in and very easily, or give me a call and I can calculate it and figure out at what rate are you getting aided at that 3rd level, and that will tell you roughly how much the property taxpayers are going to pick up and how much the state's going to pick up. And it's different for every district. And I think it's, when I used to go and talk to districts on referenda, we did a number of studies for districts that essentially they wanted a 3rd party to come in and just lay out the facts for the public, because a lot of times, again, we get misinformation on some of this stuff. And one of the things that in addition to going through all of the numbers, one of the things we always emphasized was this should be the case always, but especially if you're going to referendum. I know that the last speaker was talking about this trust. Districts that are successful in passing a referendum, more often than not, are there is a trust between the board and the superintendent, and really a trust between the board, the administration, and the public. If there's that level of trust and you're honest with them and you're upfront about here's what the things are, you have a better chance of passing that referendum than if you come in and you say, well, the state's going to pick up 2/3 of the cost when that might not be true. So I think knowing that number, whatever that number is, and being honest with the public about what it's going to mean. That happened in Stoughton. In Stoughton, in 2006, I think, they went to referendum, and it was kind of a disaster. It got turned down. 4 years later, 5 years later, they went back and they had a better plan. They were very upfront about everything, about what was going on with the district, why they needed, what they had done up to that point, in terms of getting their finances in order and whatever. And basically, there's nothing more that we can cut. And the referendum passed by a fairly comfortable margin. So, I think being honest with the public, making sure that they understand the challenges that you're facing, and again, being honest with what it's going to cost them. A district like Beloit, again, because of your low level of aid, the state might be covering 70 or 80% of that cost. I don't know what it is. But it might be a fairly big chunk. So, again, it's very easy to figure out what that level is.
Okay, thank you. And just for the record, I'm not proposing that we go to referendum.
Thank you, John, for clearing that up. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, I don't see any more. Thank you very much, Dale, for being with us tonight and your overview of school finance and answering our questions. We very much appreciate it.
All right, and I'm willing to talk if anybody has more detailed questions or whatever. Give me a call at the Counties Association, and I'm more than happy to talk to you and walk you through anything.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right, you bet.
All right. Before we start adjourning, I want to thank all the board members and Dr. Keyser and Michelle and the audience at home. This workshop really touched on two of the very most important things that we do as a board, two of our primary functions. And so I appreciate the time that everybody put into tonight and to Dr. Bales and Dale for being with us and helping us out with these two topics. With that, we completed everything on the agenda. So is there a motion to adjourn the workshop?
So moved.
So moved.
I second.
Okay, we have a motion, a second to adjourn. Any other questions or discussion regarding adjournment? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night.